EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Alabama lawmakers will face a budget deficit in excess of $200 million in the 2015 legislative session. And unlike Congress, which can run up trillions of dollars of national debt, Alabama must pass a balanced budget each year. So, should Alabama raise taxes to balance the budget and encourage economic growth, or should we cut spending? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss this issue will be my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dan Smith. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back on.
So let's get started here. What's Alabama's current budget situation, and what are we likely to end up doing?
Well, as with all political nature, it seems, across countries and within states, our politicians have spent what we have given them, and now they want to spend even more. So right now they're actually seeking to fill a budget gap, a short-term budget gap of over to between 200 and 300 million, and a long-term budget gap of 700 million. And rather than seeking to cut spending, what they're seeking to do is to raise revenue by increasing taxes on Alabamians.
So, just to explain, our state does have a balanced budget requirement. So every year, the state legislature, the governor has to propose, and then the legislature has to approve a balanced budget. Correct?
Yeah, and that's what's creating this short-term budget gap. Is that right now they don't have a way to fill that gap and spend what they want to spend.
And one way to remedy this problem would be to try to raise taxes, and that's what Governor Bentley may be planning to do here in the near future, right?
Yeah, he's proposing something that he actually promised to the Alabama people that he would not do, and that's to raise taxes. So rather than try to cut out unnecessary expenditures, cut duplicated services, maybe even unnecessary services that are currently in Alabama's budget, what he's proposing is going against what he promised the Alabama people and hiking taxes, especially in terms of income taxes, by removing some deductions that we have at the state level.
Now, one of the issues that's arising here in our current budget deficit situation is the fact that we have this general fund, and then we have the educational trust fund, and Alabama is doing what economists call earmarking its taxes to a great extent. So if you could explain a little bit about what's involved with earmarking.
Yeah, so one of the major problems and what's creating this budget gap is in the general fund budget. And we have several different funds, including the education trust fund, and tax revenues that are collected are guaranteed to are earmarked specifically for that purpose. So a certain percentage of the income tax in Alabama is guaranteed to go towards the education trust fund. And you can only fund, the intent is that you can only fund educational purposes out of that budget. And what that does is it binds the hands of politicians. The voters get together and say, these are what we think the state should spend money on, and nothing else. And these tax revenues should go towards this and no other pet projects. So it's a great way to bind the hands of politicians, especially politicians that you don't trust, or that, so complicated. Maybe you live in Birmingham, you don't know what's going on all the time in Montgomery. Maybe it's not so transparent what the money is being spent on. There's not open line-by-line budgets for all these agencies that receive money. So a great way to control these politicians and keep them in line is to say, you can only spend this money on these purposes.
Now, most states do earmark at least some portion of their tax revenues, but Alabama is, I think, by far the outlier amongst the states in terms of the extent to which we earmark our taxes, right?
Yeah, so in Alabama, across the nation, about 25%, or states earmark about 25% of their budgets. But in Alabama, it's upwards to 70-80% of our budget is actually earmarked. So that means that the citizens of Alabama actually have a lot more control over what our politicians are spending money on. And
so if we have this situation, I mean, I guess we've touched on it a little bit, but if you could elaborate some, I mean, what would, from a citizen standpoint, what's really the real argument here for earmarking? Because some people could look at it as just you're tying the politicians' hands, and it does create at least this problem of you have to match tax revenues to these different funds, and a shortfall in any one of the areas can lead to a budget deficit, right?
Yeah, so it does create some inflexibility, but there is a way through the Constitution. We can amend the Constitution if the politicians think that it's actually there's a legitimate reason to change this allocation, change the earmarking. They can come to the Alabama people and say, this is necessary, this is why, and then we can have a constitutional amendment to reform that. So there are ways. It's not as inflexible as a lot of politicians say it is, but the primary role is it prevents politicians from spending money in ways that they, may not benefit the people of Alabama, but would actually benefit them politically, and payouts to special interest groups and such that you see probably to much higher degrees in other states that don't have such of a high degree of earmarking.
Now, another issue that's been raised about our tax system here in Alabama recently is by a group called the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Has criticized Alabama's tax system for being quite regressive, one of the more regressive systems in this across the country. Before we get into the details of that, could you explain for us what is exactly meant by a regressive tax or a progressive tax?
Yeah, so economists throw around these terms, and what regressive means is it just means that the burden of the tax falls disproportionately on the poor rather than on the wealthy. And for a progressive tax, it means that as incomes rise, that the wealthy end up paying more and a higher percentage of the tax. So in Alabama, according to the report, what they found is that our tax rates are actually very regressive in that the lowest 20% are paying 10% of their income, and then the top 1% in Alabama are only paying 3.8% of their income. So the wealthy in Alabama, the top 1%, are paying a substantially smaller share of their income in towards state taxes.
No, I think this report labeled Alabama as like the 12th most regressive state, just by comparing these percentages across the different brackets. Why is it that our tax system is regressive and versus, like, say, the federal government system, which is, I think, known to be progressive, right?
Yeah, so the primary reason that the Alabama is ranked as having such a regressive tax system is that essentially we have a flat tax at one level for almost all of taxpayers except for the lowest income groups. And we offer a federal tax deduction on state taxes. So the more you pay in federal taxes, and federal taxes are very progressive, though the wealthy pay substantially more, you get to deduct that from your state taxes. So the wealthy obviously are going to benefit a lot more from a federal tax deduction at the state level than the poor will, because the poor actually get money back through the federal tax system. So that makes it a tax system in Alabama very regressive. And there's also other things such as liquor, wine, beer taxes, and the sales tax in Alabama. Right. And those, as a percentage of income, poor people pay more of their income buying wine or buying groceries than the wealthy do. So those tend to be regressive taxes as well.
Yeah, I know we do have, I think Alabama uses the sales tax to a much larger extent than most other states. And in fact, we don't exempt groceries, I believe, from our sales tax, and we're running maybe 2 or 3 states that don't. But in reality, I think some of these elements of our tax system are being shaped by some other elements of our constitutional basis for our state tax system. Alabama's rather unique in many ways in our tax system, right? We have some additional constraints on our politicians that go beyond the balanced budget constraint and beyond even the earmarking, right? Yeah,
absolutely. In addition to the traditional constraints that other states offer, we have this earmarking constraint. We also have our tax rates in the Constitution. So that means in order to hike up taxes on citizens in Alabama, we actually need to change that in the Constitution and allow for those rates to be increased. So it adds a layer of protection for taxpayers against politicians that enjoy spending money and end up having to hike up taxes to pay the bill. It adds a little bit more responsibility to the system.
And so you're saying is actually like our top allowable tax rate is set in the Constitution, right?
Yeah, so it's set right there in the Constitution so that politicians cannot change that unless they go to the people of Alabama and make an argument in a case that they approve of.
Okay, so and that actually has had an effect in terms of what taxes we end up using, because I think the Constitution sets a 5% top personal income tax rate for us, and we've reached that tax rate a long time ago, and so that sort of has shaped some of the factors you mentioned about the regressivity of our income tax, right?
Yeah, so they try to get around that constitutional limit. So it says 5% in the Constitution. So what they did is they gradually extended that 5% tax to almost all taxpayers in Alabama. I think the income limit for not paying that 5% is pretty low, like under $5,000, $10,000 off the top of my head. So essentially, it's been applied to all citizens. You've also seen now with the current proposals of Bentley trying to hike taxes, what he's actually trying to do is he doesn't want to go through the constitutional route and actually raise those tax rates. What he's seeking to do is actually to remove deductions, like specifically the federal tax deduction at the state level, and that would be a tax hike that wouldn't actually be a tax hike per the Constitution, because it'll still be 5%, we'll just be removing these federal tax deductions.
In Alabama, we also have our property tax rates set in the Constitution as well. So lawmakers haven't had the opportunity to raise, well, at least on their own, raise property tax rates either, right? And so that's sort of then pushed us into the sales tax, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's far more reliance on the sales tax than other states, and that's likely one of the major factors, is that they haven't, and it shows the effectiveness of these constitutional constraints, because they haven't changed those, but they have sought to change taxes outside of the system that they found loopholes that they could still get to. So if anything, rather than remove those taxes from the Constitution, what we should do is add in those other taxes into the Constitution as well to prevent more monkeying around without coming to the Alabama people first to raise taxes.
And I think it's ironic, because since the state legislators can increase the sales tax that they apply, I read recently that I think there's been like 40 adjustments or increases in the sales tax rate in Alabama since they were first authorized back in the 1930s, and the income tax rates have been raised a grand total of 4 times. So it's been it's proven a lot harder for state lawmakers to go to the voters and ask for the permission to raise our income tax rates or property tax rates than it has been to raise sales taxes.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, there's actually some economic theory, or economic and public choice theory that lies behind such constitutional level restrictions on taxation, right? So if you could, talk a little bit about the public choice and then constitutional economics behind this.
Yeah, so public choice economics is just economics applied to public policy making. And it's public policy makers as they actually are. Not as we'd like them to be, not as ideal philosopher kings, but as real life person who are going to get in office. They may not have the proper motivations. They may want to cater to special interest groups. They may have personal agendas, as well as they may not have the perfect knowledge. They may not know the optimal economic policy to impose. So if you do set up political institutions with public choice in mind, you're going to set up a political and economic system that is robust to deviations away from philosopher kings. You're actually going to make a system that works even if we don't have the best people to run it, which is obviously true in most cases. And
this gentleman here is one of probably the greatest economists of the 20th century, James Buchanan, who taught at George Mason, where we both went to graduate school, right? And he really pioneered both public choice economics, and then as a remedy for the problems he saw in public choice economics, his whole idea of constitutional level constraints on government.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for his work, and asked by reporters that weren't familiar with economics to describe why he won the prize, he said, "Don't let the fox guard the chicken coop." And what he meant by that is you got to set up a political system that doesn't allow politicians and special interest groups to completely fleece the taxpayers. You got to set up constitutional limitations to prevent fraudulent or crony behavior on the part of politicians, because that's their incentive once they get into office.
And the balanced budget constraints are of the same nature, right? They're remedying a problem that we saw in the 1800s of states borrowing excessively and borrowing themselves into bankruptcy. And then states impose these balanced budget provisions as a result, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So balanced budget constraints are a very important one. These earmarks we've been discussing, another important constitutional constraint. So there's ways that we could try to bind politicians' behavior to prevent negative public policy from emerging due to the behavior of politicians.
Okay, so we have these constitutional restrictions in place on our tax system, which I think there's certainly a rationale for having them there because of some of the problems we might observe otherwise. They don't prevent the tax rates from going up, since all the politicians would have to do is actually make a case to Alabamians about raising our tax rates if they really think it's such a good idea. So we come back to this issue of the budget shortfall this year. Mm-hmm. And should we raise taxes, perhaps in the methods that Governor Bentley's proposing, to do whatever you can without going to the citizens to amend the Constitution, or should we cut spending? What does the research show in terms of the effects of taxation and tax rates on state economies?
Yeah, so there's just clear and consistent evidence on this that raising taxes hurts economic growth, hurts big job growth, hurts income growth. It definitely hurts the economies of states, especially considering the immense taxes imposed at the federal level. Mm-hmm. And certainly our state politicians can't control what's going on at the federal level, right. But we certainly shouldn't make the problem worse by piling on additional taxes. Now, I think we should certainly make our tax system less regressive. Mm-hmm. We should fix that problem, make for a more equal tax structure. I think that's conducive for economic growth and prosperity. But we shouldn't do it in a way that jacks up the tax rates on Alabamians. We should do it in a revenue-neutral manner, and we should address these budget gap problems as spending problems rather than revenue problems.
Okay. So one issue that some citizens might be raising, or some of our viewers might be thinking at this point in time, is like the state has given a lot of tax breaks to major manufacturers to come to Alabama, and they've given these big corporations all these tax breaks. They're not paying their share of the corporate income tax. If we had been taxing these companies, or if we had fewer of these deals, would that help our current budget situation?
Yeah, so these economic incentive programs, when you look across the nation and even state-specific studies, what you find is that they don't actually increase job growth and economic growth or income growth. And the reason for it is these are oftentimes short-term jobs. Mm-hmm. They promise a lot of jobs, they're job announcements, but actually the jobs don't materialize, especially 1-2 years down the road. So they end up being a bad deal for taxpayers. And unfortunately, what they do is they take money, they tax businesses that would grow and expand, they tax Alabamians themselves that would invest those dollars, and they give it to favored corporations that are already fairly wealthy, probably from out of state, and mm-hmm. Probably don't have actual sustainable jobs that they're creating. They're talking a big talk, but actually don't end up walking the walk oftentimes.
But even when they do, because I think certainly Honda and Mercedes have located plants here. I mean, they're still not paying taxes, and that ultimately is someday, we're collecting fewer tax dollars today because they're not paying their taxes, right?
Yes, so those economic incentive packages that have been delivered to these businesses over time have definitely contributed to, and maybe even could fill this entire budget gap that we have, given the lost revenue due to all of these tax breaks and subsidies and job training programs and things like that. Mm-hmm.
Well, given that the state's already entered into these agreements, they probably can't go back on their word, and it probably wouldn't be a good thing for them to want to go back on their word on these development deals. So that leads us to spending. Mm-hmm. And so at one level, Alabama has had a pretty decent amount of austerity in recent years. State employees and state teachers haven't received much in the way of raises since mm-hmm. 2008. and that there have been a lot of cuts in education budgets. I mean, the Hoover schools are thinking about still going about cutting bus service. So I mean, there have been a lot of cuts, and so is there still room to cut further? And so I think people could reasonably argue at this point in time, we've been practicing a lot of austerity and cutting a lot of spending over the last few years. Is there any spending left to cut?
Yeah, I'd definitely say there has been important budget cuts, but certainly not enough. If you look across the nation, Alabama still has more public employees per private citizen. They're in the top 10 for that. We also have much higher public compensation than most other states as well. So both in terms we have more public employees and we compensate them more than other states. There's certainly plenty of room for cutting. Also, I did a study on school service privatization, privatizing janitorial, bus transportation, food service workers, and the such. And less than 20% of school districts actually take advantage of privatizing those services, which would channel savings back into the classroom for those students. So across the board, I think there's still plenty of areas to cut. Another idea that I mentioned in a recent AL.com op-ed is ABC stores, which are liquor stores in Alabama. So these stores are owned and operated by the state of Alabama to sell liquor in competition with private liquor stores. And we could easily privatize these stores, auction off the liquor license for a one-time gain, and allow the tax revenue to be collected by private liquor stores, as they already are doing.
So if you could expand on this a little bit, how exactly would the privatization of these stores end up helping the state budget in the near term? Because I was looking at the numbers, and it actually looks like, given that they actually have revenues too. I mean, they have costs, but they have revenues, and it looks like largely their revenues are covering the cost. So how is it that we would end up helping out our budget?
Yeah, so right now they're collecting taxes that we could set, when we transfer to the private liquor stores, we could set it in a revenue neutral manner so that we could still collect the same taxes from the private liquor stores. And then we wouldn't have all those expenses. Right now they have over 120 stores. They actually don't own the land. What they do is they rent it out each year.
Right.
So that's a lot of rent that the state is paying for these stores, usually in prominent locations across Alabama. There's also 900 employees operating these stores. So taking them out of the pension system and off the payroll and turning them over to the private sector, they're likely private stores that purchased up the liquor licenses would be willing to hire these workers. It'd take those expenses off the budget for Alabama, creating a one-time gain that could help us fill this budget gap.
What might be some other things we could do to reduce spending?
Yeah, so other ideas that could come up with, so in addition to refraining from engaging in economic incentive deals, you could also refrain from engaging in film subsidy deals as well. Alabama has tried to get into that game, offering millions of dollars to big budget films, and there's consistent evidence on this that this does not increase economic growth or prosperity as well. So that's another way going forward that we should just refrain from making those types of deals. One idea that I offered in the op-ed, and this is through the RSA, which is included in the general fund as well, but simple ideas such as not mailing out the RSA newsletter. It's mailed out to 338,000 members monthly, and it's put online already in PDF form. They could simply just email it out to the members, and that, from just a back of the envelope calculation, I think this is pretty conservative, would save approximately $2 million just off the bat. So I think there's plenty of ways that we could prevent frivolous expenditures like that are going on. They're right before our eyes. And also, we could eliminate duplication of services across government agencies as well to foster savings.
You mentioned the film industry subsidies, and that's a popular item across all different states. I mean, they all seem, I guess every state thinks that they're going to be the next Hollywood or something, but I think it also sort of maybe shows some of the problems, some of the skepticism that citizens have with the way government might otherwise spend our money, that they will pursue these somewhat highly dubious ideas like trying to lure the film industry here, or try to get movies filmed here in Alabama. I'm sure it ends up providing some benefits to some people, especially the whoever from the state gets to rub shoulders with movie stars and producers when they're here to film a movie. But it's not the kind of thing that's going to help the average Alabamian very much, right?
Yeah, if anything, what I think this demonstrates is the need for more earmark reform, that we need more earmarks to prevent politicians from spending money on these things that have a proven abysmal track record of wasting taxpayers' money. To the extent that we could tie their hands and prevent them from pursuing those types of policies, taxpayers in Alabama would be much better off. And as we mentioned before, raising taxes is going to hurt Alabama long term. It's going to hurt our ability to attract businesses and invest and grow, make it harder for entrepreneurs to come here. So it should be only resorted to as a last ditch effort, and they should come to the Alabama people as per the Constitution, ask for that tax hike and say this is what we're going to spend the money on, rather than going through kind of backdoor mechanisms and trying to avoid those constitutional constraints.
Well, yeah, and we certainly you see, in addition with the higher taxes, I mean, if we do raise taxes, to some extent, I always like to think of it, when the state makes a deal with a company to reduce their taxes or rebate their taxes when they locate here, they're in effect saying, as the state policymakers are saying, like, we know you couldn't actually profitably operate a business in Alabama if you had to pay all the taxes we say you have to. So we'll give you a deal and give you a break on some of these taxes. But if we raise taxes further, it's just going to contribute to that high burden of taxes on all the businesses.
Yeah, that's exactly the way to think about it. We're essentially bribing companies to come here despite the tax policies that we have in place. A recent report from the Tax Foundation found that our state business tax climate was ranked 38th in the nation. Not a very conducive environment for attracting businesses. The state policymakers would be much better off, rather than spending money to bribing specific companies to come here, rather just saying let's lower taxes overall, lower regulation overall, and just make Alabama the place to do business, kind of like Texas or North Dakota, and that's going to attract companies to come here, and that eventually will raise revenues as they come here and do business.
And just to close, you mentioned the issue of excessive numbers of public employees. That Alabama has a lot of public state and local employees relative to other states. I mean, that seems to almost be a piece with the idea of looking to the government to lure in manufacturing companies for the state, right? We almost like expect that politicians need to drive economic prosperity.
Yeah, really what politicians should consider their job when it comes to the economy is just setting the conditions, making conducive conditions for entrepreneurs, business owners to come here, to expand, open up businesses, things like that. They're not supposed to be directing business creation. They're not supposed to be picking the winners and losers. That's akin to socialism and towards a path towards that type of economic planning. In capitalism, you set the right environments, keep low taxes, limited government, and you allow the businesses and entrepreneurs to be the ones to grow and expand.
Well, we can care about jobs and want to see more jobs in Alabama, but that's not necessarily a job for our politicians to take care of. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Dan, and enjoyed the talk. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.